It was a normal day in 2005 when everything suddenly changed for one family in New Mexico. A young girl vanished without a trace, leaving her parents, her friends, and her community heartbroken and desperate for answers. At first, people thought she might have just wandered off, maybe gone to see a friend or taken a different way home. But as hours turned into days and days turned into weeks, it became painfully clear that something far more serious had happened. The posters went up quickly. The word missing was printed in bold red letters across her photo. Her face became known all over the state, and soon even the entire country was hearing about the little girl who never came home. Neighbors joined search parties. Helicopters hovered over empty desert roads and police combed through fields, forests, and small towns. Everyone wanted to believe she would be found alive. Everyone wanted to believe there would be good news. But that news never came. The case slowly turned into a nightmare. The days of searching stretched into months, and the months into years. The family's hope began to crumble under the heavy silence. The girl's bedroom stayed exactly the same, as if waiting for her to walk back in. But the truth was harsher. The police had no suspects, no solid evidence, and no real answers. The case grew cold. Cold cases are some of the hardest tragedies for families to endure. They are stories with no ending, questions with no answers, wounds that never close. And for this family, every holiday, every birthday, every anniversary was just another reminder that their daughter was still gone. For more than a decade, her disappearance haunted the community. Teachers remembered her as a bright and curious child. Friends talked about the laughter she brought to school. Parents used her story to warn their own children about being careful when walking alone. She became a ghostly figure in local memory, a symbol of heartbreak, and a question mark that nobody could erase. But here's the thing about cold cases. Sometimes when the world has forgotten, the truth finds a way back to the surface. Sometimes, a single piece of evidence that was overlooked or couldn't be tested before finally breaks through the silence. That's exactly what happened here. In recent years, law enforcement began reopening old cases using new forensic technology. Evidence that had been sitting in a box for years, untouched and collecting dust, was tested again. This time it revealed something shocking. Something that would lead to an arrest that nobody saw coming. The community that had lived for so long with unanswered questions was about to get the closure they never thought they'd see. The family that had prayed for justice would finally have a name, a face, and the truth behind what really happened all those years ago. This wasn't just a case about one missing girl anymore. It became a powerful reminder that justice never truly disappears, even when it takes decades to arrive. And as we begin this story, one thing is clear. Asterisk, asterisk. The silence of the past has finally been broken. It was a warm afternoon in New Mexico, the kind of day where the desert sun painted the sky orange and the air seemed to stand still. The girl, only a child at the time, was walking home from school like she had done so many times before. It was supposed to be a simple, ordinary day, but what happened on that day would change her family's life forever. She left school carrying her backpack, smiling as she said goodbye to her friends. Witnesses later remembered her braids swinging behind her, her small shoes kicking up dust as she walked. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but somewhere between school and home she vanished. At first, nobody thought too much of it. Kids sometimes take longer to get home. Maybe she stopped by a friend's house, maybe she got distracted at the store, maybe she was playing outside. Her parents expected her to walk through the door at any moment. But the minutes turned into hours, and soon worry began to creep in. By evening, her family knew something was wrong. She never stayed out late. She wasn't the type to disappear without telling anyone where she was going. Panic began to grow. Her parents started calling friends, neighbors, even teachers, but nobody had seen her. The town felt small and connected, yet suddenly she seemed to have disappeared into thin air. When the sun went down and there was still no sign of her, fear took over. The family called the police. Within hours, a missing child alert was issued. Flyers with her photo were printed overnight and plastered on every street corner. The word missing glared out in big red letters, her innocent face staring back at strangers who passed by. The next morning, the search began. Officers spread out through the streets, combing fields, dirt roads, and abandoned buildings. Volunteers lined up to help, forming search groups that walked in long lines across open land, calling out her name again and again. Helicopters scanned the desert from above, their lights sweeping across the ground, but there was nothing, no tracks, no clothing, no signs of a struggle. The family begged the public for help. On the news, her mother's voice cracked as she pleaded, "If anyone has her, please bring her home." Her father stood silent beside her, eyes hollow, holding a photo of his daughter tightly in his hands. The community felt their pain deeply. Strangers who had never even met the girl showed up to search, donate food, and offer comfort. But the days dragged on, and the hope of finding her alive began to fade. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered that maybe she had run away, though her parents refused to believe that. Others feared something far darker, that she had been taken. Every car that slowed down on the street, every unfamiliar face in town, every strange noise at night suddenly carried suspicion. Fear tightened its grip on the community. Police followed every lead they could. They questioned neighbors, interviewed bus drivers, and checked security cameras from local stores. They even brought in dogs to track her scent. For a while it seemed like they might be close. There were reports of a car seen near her route home, a man asking questions about children at a gas station, and even calls claiming sightings of the girl miles away, but each lead eventually ended in disappointment. Weeks passed and the energy of the search began to slow. Volunteers had to return to work. The media moved on to other stories, and the posters faded under the hot desert sun. For the family, however, time stood still. Her room stayed exactly as it was, her toys neatly in place, her bed made, her favorite sweater hanging by the closet door. Every time the phone rang, her parents jumped, hoping for news only to be crushed when it wasn't her. What made it even harder was the silence. There were no ransom calls, no letters, no real evidence. It was as if she had been swallowed by the earth itself. For a child to vanish without a single trace left behind, it didn't make sense. It left behind only questions and no answers. As the weeks turned into months, the case grew colder. Investigators kept working, but with so little evidence they hit a wall. Each year that passed made the mystery heavier, and yet her face remained on bulletin boards, in police databases, and in the minds of everyone who had known her. For her parents, life became a cycle of waiting. Birthdays were the hardest. They lit candles for her every year, hoping she was still alive somewhere. They imagined her growing up, what her voice would sound like as a teenager, how tall she would be, whether she would still love drawing like she did as a child. The pain of not knowing was unbearable. In small towns, people don't forget. Even after years had passed, locals still remembered the missing girl. Some said they still looked for her face in crowds. Others admitted they checked abandoned houses or empty lots, hoping for a clue. It wasn't just the family's tragedy, it became the community's scar. What nobody knew then was that the truth was sitting quietly, buried in the evidence boxes the police had stored away. A single piece of evidence from that very day, the day she went missing, would one day unlock the entire mystery. But at the time, in 2005, all that remained was fear, heartbreak, and silence. The day she disappeared was the day innocence was stolen from her town. From then on, the community was never the same. Children were no longer allowed to walk home alone. Parents locked their doors earlier. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. Her absence was everywhere, in every corner of life. And as the years stretched on, her story slowly shifted from breaking news to a cold case, one of those files gathering dust in a cabinet, waiting for someone to care enough to open it again. Little did anyone know, it would take more than a decade before the truth of that day finally came to light. When news spread that the young girl had gone missing, the entire town seemed to stop. At first there was confusion. People thought, she'll turn up, maybe she went to a friend's house, maybe she just got lost for a while. But as hours passed, hope turned into something heavier. Fear began to creep in, and soon the whole community was living under its shadow. Small towns are often tight-knit. Everyone knows each other, or at least knows of each other. Neighbors wave when passing. Teachers recognize kids outside of school, and store clerks remember the names of families. That's why this disappearance was so shocking. In a place where people felt safe, where doors were often left unlocked, something terrible had happened. A child was gone. Within days, the town looked different. Streets that were once lively became quiet. Parents no longer let their children play outside without supervision. Parks and playgrounds, once filled with laughter, suddenly stood empty. People who used to walk alone at night now stayed inside. It was as if an invisible fog of fear had rolled in, and it never left. The local police station was flooded with calls. Some were tips, others were fears. One woman reported seeing a suspicious van circling her neighborhood. Another man swore he saw a stranger watching children near a bus stop, but when police followed up, the details often fell apart. Some sightings were coincidences. Others were the result of heightened fear, where every shadow looked dangerous, every stranger looked guilty. The town began to divide. Some believed a stranger had come through, a drifter who had taken the girl and vanished without a trace. Others whispered darker theories that someone from within their own community had done it. The idea that the threat might be someone familiar was the most unsettling of all. People began looking at neighbors differently, questioning old friendships, wondering who could possibly be hiding something so awful. Schools added stricter rules. Teachers reminded children to walk in groups, never alone. The phrase "stranger danger" echoed in classrooms. Parents held their kids' hands tighter, scanning the streets with worried eyes. Even the simplest routines, going to the store, walking to school, visiting a friend, were no longer ordinary. Everything carried risk. At night, the fear was worse. Rumors spread quickly, like wildfire. Some said they heard strange noises in the woods. Others claimed to see flickering lights near abandoned houses. Teenagers told each other ghost stories, mixing truth with fiction until nobody knew what to believe. But behind the stories was a real, lingering terror. Someone out there knew what happened to the girl. Someone out there had taken her, and until they were caught, nobody felt safe. The family's grief was at the center of it all. Every time they appeared on TV begging for answers, the community felt their pain. The mother's voice cracked with desperation, her words breaking hearts across the town. "Please, if you know anything, say something. We just want our daughter back." Her father, often silent, carried an expression that never seemed to change, tired, broken, but still holding on to hope. Churches held vigils. Hundreds gathered with candles in their hands, their faces glowing in the dark. Songs were sung, prayers whispered, and her name carried into the night sky. For a moment it seemed like the whole town was united, standing together in hope. But even then, an unspoken truth lingered. Hope was fading and fear was winning. Detectives admitted to the family that without new leads, the trail was running cold. They had searched everywhere: the desert, abandoned buildings, creeks, and highways. Nothing. Each search ended in disappointment. Each day without answers stretched the family thinner. The police didn't say it out loud, but many began to wonder, was she still alive? The community held on, but not without scars. People began locking their doors earlier, installing new locks, buying dogs for protection. Gun sales went up. For the first time in years, families no longer trusted their small town safety. Parents drove their kids to school instead of letting them walk. Teenagers who once wandered freely now had curfews. The fear turned inward too. People asked themselves impossible questions. What if it was someone I know? What if the person responsible is still walking among us? At grocery stores, whispers followed. People noticed who seemed nervous, who avoided eye contact, who changed their stories when asked where they were that day. Innocent people suddenly found themselves under suspicion, and friendships cracked under the pressure. The worst part was the silence. There were no new clues, no messages, no evidence pointing to where she might be. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, and with no answers, the community was left to fill the silence with their own fears. As months turned into years, that fear never fully went away. Even children who grew up after the disappearance heard the story. They were warned about what happened to that little girl, a story told like a cautionary tale. To this day, older neighbors admit they still don't let their grandchildren walk alone, all because of what happened back then. The girl's face, frozen in time on missing posters, became part of the town's identity. People could not forget her, even when they tried. She was the girl who never came home, the reason people stopped trusting the safety of their small town. The tragedy was no longer just about a missing child. It was about a community haunted by what it didn't know. Fear had moved into their homes, and it stayed there, quietly shaping their lives. And yet, somewhere in the middle of that fear, determination still burned. Some people refused to give up. Detectives quietly revisited the case files year after year. Volunteers kept her picture in public places. And her parents, though broken, continued to push, to fight, and to hope. The community reaction showed two sides of humanity: fear and unity. Fear tore away the innocence of their daily lives, but unity kept them going, reminding everyone that no matter how dark it seemed, they weren't alone. Still, the mystery loomed, unanswered and unsolved. And with every year that passed, the question grew louder: what really happened to her, and who in their town might hold the secret? Time has a strange way of moving after a tragedy. At first, the days crawl by, heavy with grief and confusion. Every hour feels endless. But then, slowly, days become weeks, weeks become months, and before long, years have slipped away. That's exactly what happened with this case. The missing girl's family found themselves stuck in a painful cycle of waiting, while the rest of the world seemed to move on. The search in those first months had been relentless. Volunteers combed the land, flyers covered telephone poles, and police chased every lead they could find. But when no solid answers came, the energy began to fade. The posters, once bright and new, became weather-worn. Rain and wind tore at their edges until their face blurred into the paper. Many were eventually taken down, replaced by newer posters for other events, other missing people, other problems. For her family, though, there was no moving on. Their home remained frozen in time. Her room was kept just as it had been. The bed neatly made, her toys sitting on the shelves, her favorite stuffed animal placed on her pillow as though she might walk through the door at any moment. Holidays became unbearable reminders of what was missing. On her birthday, her parents baked a cake and lit candles, their voices trembling as they whispered wishes into the air. Christmases and Thanksgivings felt incomplete, the empty chair at the table always too obvious. Each year, without answers, added another layer of pain. Grief, unlike a wound that heals, remained raw and open. For her parents, it wasn't just the sorrow of losing a child, it was the not knowing that hurt the most. Was she alive somewhere waiting to be found, or had she been taken forever? The uncertainty was a cruel kind of torture. The police, too, struggled. Detectives had done everything they could with the technology of the time, but there were limits. Without DNA matches, without reliable witnesses, and without new evidence, the case hit a dead end. It was officially marked as a cold case. That phrase itself felt like a death sentence to many families because it meant the investigation had no active leads. For the family, it felt like their daughter had been forgotten. But there were small glimmers of hope. Every once in a while, a new tip would surface. A caller would swear they saw a girl who looked just like her in another state. A letter would arrive claiming to know where she was. Someone would report seeing a suspicious person years later who matched an old sketch. Each time, the family's hearts would rise with cautious hope. Each time they waited for a miracle. But just as quickly, hope was crushed. The sightings were false. The letters were hoaxes. Some people, cruelly, seemed to enjoy playing with the family's pain, and every time a lead collapsed, it left her parents more broken than before. The community also carried the silence with them. Even years later, people remembered her face. Some admitted they still looked for her in crowds, glancing twice whenever they saw a girl with similar features. Others kept her photo taped to their refrigerators or tucked inside their wallets as a quiet reminder. The case became part of the town's identity, a story whispered to newcomers, a reminder of the danger that once struck their quiet streets. Yet, the silence weighed heavily. Rumors kept circling. Was it a stranger who had come through town, or was it someone who lived among them, blending in all along? People still wondered, still worried. Even as the years stretched on, the fear never truly left. For the detectives who had first worked the case, the silence was frustrating. They often admitted privately that it was the one case that haunted them. Some retired with regret, carrying the weight of not finding her. Others, long after moving to different departments, still kept her file tucked away in their minds. Her family refused to give up. They spoke at schools, reminding other children to stay safe. They worked with organizations dedicated to missing persons, making sure their daughter's name was never forgotten. Each year, they held a vigil on the anniversary of her disappearance. Balloons were released into the sky, prayers were said, candles were lit. Even when attendance grew smaller over time, the family kept going because stopping felt like betraying her memory. The years of silence took their toll. Her mother's hair grew gray far too early. Her father aged faster than his years. Their faces carried permanent lines of sorrow, but inside them a small flame still burned, the belief that one day, somehow, the truth would come out. Technology was advancing too. As the 2010s came, DNA testing grew stronger, databases expanded, and new forensic tools became available. While her family lived with heartbreak, evidence from her case sat quietly in boxes, waiting, pieces of clothing, samples, old reports, all preserved even if they had seemed useless before. And that was the cruel irony of the years of silence. While nothing seemed to be happening on the outside, in reality, time was preparing the answers. The silence wasn't the end of her story. It was only a long pause before the truth was uncovered. For the family, the silence was the hardest part. Not knowing where she was, not knowing if she suffered, not knowing if she was still out there waiting for help. The silence left them with a hole that could never be filled. But they never stopped hoping. They never stopped waiting. They never stopped fighting to keep her story alive. And though they didn't know it yet, after years of waiting in silence, a breakthrough was finally coming, one that would shatter everything they thought they knew and bring them closer to the truth than they had ever been before. For years, it felt like the missing girl's case had been frozen in time. The posters had faded, the crowds had gone home, and her name was spoken only in quiet whispers at church or at the yearly vigils her parents organized. But then, after more than a decade of silence, something happened. A small detail, buried deep inside an evidence box, began to speak louder than ever before. It started with a cold case unit. In many states, special teams are formed to revisit unsolved crimes. They go back to old files, looking with fresh eyes and using new technology that didn't exist years earlier. Sometimes it's a long shot, but every once in a while it leads to answers. One detective, newly assigned to the case, opened the old evidence boxes. Inside were the same items collected years ago: clothing, personal belongings, photographs, reports. Most people had looked at them dozens of times before, but this detective thought differently. What if the evidence itself hasn't changed, he thought, but our tools for looking at it have? Among the items was a small piece of fabric, something the girl had been wearing the day she went missing. Back in 2005, the labs had tested it, but the results were limited. DNA testing then was not as advanced as it is today, but now in the 2010s, forensic science had improved dramatically. Detectives decided to test the fabric again, this time using the newest methods. Weeks passed. The family didn't even know another test was being run. They had learned not to get their hopes up. Too many false starts, too many dead ends. But then, one day, the phone rang at the station. The lab had results. And this time, it was different. The new test revealed DNA that hadn't been detected before. It didn't belong to the girl. It belonged to someone else, an adult male. Suddenly, after more than a decade, investigators had something solid, something real, a trace of the person who had been with her that day. The DNA was uploaded into national databases. At first, there was no match, but cold case detectives don't stop there. They compared it against newer systems, checked criminal databases, and even tried emerging technology that could build a family tree from genetic material. Slowly, a picture began to form. Meanwhile, the detective revisited old witness statements. He noticed small details that had been overlooked before, like the report of a car that had been parked near her walking route, or a neighbor who remembered a man asking unusual questions about children in the area. Back then, those leads had gone nowhere. Now, combined with the new DNA evidence, they pointed in the same direction. Bit by bit, the pieces started to connect. The name that surfaced was shocking. It wasn't a drifter or a stranger passing through town. It was someone who had once lived nearby, someone who had blended into the community so well that few had ever suspected him. He had even attended some of the community searches, pretending to help while quietly hiding the darkest of secrets. Detectives dug into his past. His record wasn't clean. He had minor arrests, but nothing that had raised alarms years ago. But looking closer, a pattern appeared. He had lived in the area at the exact time the girl vanished. He moved away shortly after the disappearance. And now, thanks to the new DNA, the link was undeniable. The discovery shook the entire investigation. After so many years of silence, the case was alive again. Detectives worked day and night, building their file, making sure the evidence was strong enough to hold in court. They interviewed old witnesses again, this time armed with new questions. Some remembered details more clearly than they had years ago. Others admitted suspicions they had once been too afraid to share. When the family was told about the breakthrough, their emotions were overwhelming. For years they had lived in limbo, not knowing what had happened to their daughter. Now, for the first time, they had something real. Her mother wept as detectives explained the DNA evidence. Her father sat in silence, gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was proof that someone was responsible, that she hadn't simply vanished into thin air. News of the breakthrough spread quickly through the town. For many, it was a relief. Finally, there was hope that the mystery might be solved. But for others, it brought new fear. If the suspect was someone they had known, someone who had walked among them all those years, what else had they been hiding? What other secrets still lingered in their quiet community? Detectives prepared for the next step, an arrest. They tracked the suspect's movements, watched his house, studied his routines. They wanted to make sure there was no chance of escape. The man had lived for years believing he had gotten away with it, but the walls were closing in. And in the end, it wasn't a grand chase or a dramatic confrontation that brought him down. It was science. A single piece of fabric, saved carefully in an evidence box, had carried the answer all along. It had just been waiting for the right time and the right people to uncover its truth. After more than a decade of silence, the case that everyone thought would never be solved was alive again, and soon the man responsible would face the justice that had been waiting for him all those years. For years, the man lived as if nothing had happened. He went about his life quietly, blending into the background, never drawing too much attention to himself. Neighbors described him as ordinary, someone you wouldn't think twice about. But detectives now knew the truth. This was the man whose DNA had been found on the girl's clothing. This was the man who had kept an entire family suffering for more than a decade. The investigation was careful and precise. Detectives couldn't afford mistakes. They tracked the suspect's daily life, where he worked, where he shopped, who he spoke to. They even collected discarded items like coffee cups or cigarette butts to test for DNA, confirming the match again and again. Every piece of evidence pointed directly to him. When the day of the arrest finally came, it was early morning. Police vehicles rolled quietly into his neighborhood, their engines low, their lights off. Officers stepped out, surrounding his home. Neighbors who peeked out of their windows later said the scene looked like something from a movie, silent, tense, and heavy with anticipation. A knock on the door shattered the quiet. "Police, open up." The suspect appeared at the doorway, confused at first, then pale as he realized what was happening. Before he could say much, he was placed in handcuffs. Years of freedom ended in a single moment. Some neighbors gathered outside, whispering in shock as they watched the man they thought they knew being led away. News of the arrest spread like wildfire. Phones rang across town, social media lit up, and within hours, reporters were at the scene. Cameras captured the suspect being placed into the back of a patrol car, his face blank, his eyes lowered. For the community, it was surreal. This was the man who had lived among them, the man who had once smiled and waved, the man who had even joined in the early searches for the missing girl. And all along, he had been hiding the darkest of truths. At the police station, detectives questioned him. They laid out the evidence: DNA results, witness reports, timelines. He denied everything at first, shaking his head, claiming he had nothing to do with it. But the evidence was too strong. Piece by piece, the detectives dismantled his lies. Finally, cornered, he fell silent. He offered no explanation, no apology, just silence. For the girl's family, the call from detectives came as both a relief and a new wave of pain. After so many years of waiting, the man responsible was finally in custody. Her mother broke down, sobbing as she clutched a photo of her daughter. Her father closed his eyes, his face a mix of anger, sorrow, and exhausted relief. They had wanted answers for so long, but hearing that the man who had taken their daughter had been so close all along was almost too much to bear. The community's reaction was explosive. Some people felt relief. Justice was finally coming. Others felt betrayed. How could it have been him? How could someone who lived among us, shopped at the same stores, waved hello on the street, have done something so evil? Conversations at local diners, barbershops, and church gatherings all centered on the arrest. The town was shaken to its core. Old memories resurfaced. People remembered small things, the way he sometimes lingered too long at playgrounds, the uneasy feeling he gave off when talking to children, the fact that he moved away right after the disappearance. Hindsight made the signs clearer, but back then, nobody had dared to accuse him. Now everything fit together in a chilling puzzle. When the suspect appeared in court for the first time, the room was packed. Journalists filled the benches, cameras clicked, and the girl's family sat quietly in the front row, holding each other for strength. The suspect stood in an orange jumpsuit, shackled, his head lowered. The judge read the charges aloud: kidnapping, murder, and concealment of evidence. Each word hit the courtroom like a hammer. Outside, the media swarmed. Headlines exploded across the country. Cold case finally cracked. Arrest made in missing girl's case. Justice after 15 years. The story spread far beyond the small town, capturing national attention. For many, it was a reminder that no crime is truly forgotten and no secret stays hidden forever. For the family, the arrest was only the beginning of another long journey through the legal system, through painful testimonies, through the memories that resurfaced with every hearing, but they faced it with courage. Her mother said in an interview, her voice trembling but strong, We've waited for this moment for so long. We know nothing will bring her back, but at least now the truth is out there. The arrest didn't erase the years of pain. It didn't bring the girl home, but it did something powerful. It shattered the silence. It proved that persistence mattered, that technology could uncover what once seemed impossible, and that justice, no matter how delayed, could still be served. As the suspect sat in his jail cell, the town began to breathe again. Parents hugged their children tighter. Neighbors looked at one another with new trust. The shadow that had hung over the community for so long had finally begun to lift. And yet, even with the arrest, one question remained heavy in everyone's heart. Why? Why did he do it? Why her? Why did he think he could live a normal life while hiding such a terrible crime? The answers may never come. Some truths, no matter how much we demand them, stay buried with the person who carries them. But one thing was certain: the girl's story was no longer just a mystery. It was now a story of justice, a story of how, even after years of silence, the truth finally caught up to the man who thought he had escaped it. The arrest was just the beginning. Now came the long, painful road through the justice system. For the family of the missing girl, it was a road they had waited on for years, hoping one day they would see the man who destroyed their lives held accountable. In the weeks after the arrest, the courtroom became the heart of the story. Reporters lined up outside every day, their cameras flashing, eager to capture the smallest detail. People from the town sat on the benches, whispering to each other, waiting for the trial to begin. It was no longer just a case. It was a piece of the town's history, something that everyone felt connected to. The suspect walked in wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, hands cuffed, a blank expression on his face. He didn't look like a monster. That was the unsettling part. He looked like an ordinary man, the kind of person you'd pass on the street and never notice. But the charges against him told another story: kidnapping, murder, and years of silence that had kept a family in agony. The prosecution came prepared. They showed the jury the DNA evidence, the timeline of his movements, and the disturbing truth that he had even helped in the community search when the girl first went missing. Jurors gasped when they heard how close he had been to the investigation all along. One juror later admitted, "It was chilling to realize he stood there pretending to care, knowing what he had done." Witnesses took the stand. Old friends, neighbors, and detectives who had never stopped working the case. Some recalled strange things about him: odd comments, nervous habits, times when he seemed to avoid questions. Others broke down in tears, reliving the search efforts, remembering the posters on telephone poles, the candlelight vigils, and the hope that one day the girl would come home. But the most emotional moment came when the girl's mother testified. She held up a picture of her daughter, her voice trembling as she spoke. She told the jury about her daughter's laughter, her dreams, and how her bedroom had been kept almost the same for years because she couldn't bear to change it. She looked directly at the man in the courtroom and said, "You took her from us, you tried to erase her, but she will never be erased. Not from our family, not from this town, and not from the world." Her words silenced the courtroom. Even the judge paused before continuing. The defense tried their best. They argued that the DNA evidence could have been a mistake, that there was no eyewitness, that too many years had passed. But their arguments fell flat. The evidence was strong. The truth was stronger. As the trial went on, the town followed every update. At local diners, people debated what the verdict would be. On social media, strangers offered prayers and messages of support. The case had gone beyond the borders of the town. People across the country were watching, waiting, and hoping justice would be done. Finally, after weeks of testimony and evidence, it came down to the jury. They deliberated for hours, the entire town holding its breath. Families sat glued to their televisions, waiting for the words that would decide the case. When the jury returned, the courtroom was silent. The judge asked for the verdict. "Guilty." The word rang through the room like thunder. Guilty on all counts. The suspect showed no emotion. He just stared down at the table, his hands folded tightly. But in the front row, the girl's family held each other and cried. For them, it wasn't joy. It was relief, mixed with sorrow, mixed with the weight of years of waiting finally lifting from their shoulders. The judge delivered the sentence: life in prison without parole. The man would never walk free again. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, cut off from the world, left only with the memory of what he had done. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was overwhelming. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed and crowds cheered. Some people cried, others clapped, and some simply stood in silence, thinking of the little girl who had been gone for so long. The girl Sep's mother spoke to reporters, her face streaked with tears. "This doesn't bring her back. Nothing ever will. But today justice was served, and maybe now we can begin to heal." Those words echoed across news outlets and social media. They became a symbol of strength, a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope can survive. In the months that followed, the town began to change. Murals were painted in the girl's memory. A scholarship was created in her name, helping other children chase the dreams she never got the chance to fulfill. At the annual candlelight vigil, more people came than ever before. They didn't just come to mourn. They came to celebrate her life, to stand together as a community that refused to be broken. For the detectives, the verdict was also a victory. Some had worked on the case from the very beginning. Others had joined later, refusing to give up even when it seemed hopeless. One detective told a local paper, "We made her a promise that we wouldn't forget. Today we kept that promise." But even with justice served, the haunting questions lingered. Why had he done it? Why her? What had driven him to such a dark act? Those answers never fully came. The man refused to explain, refusing to give the family the closure they so desperately wanted. That silence became his last cruelty. Still, the verdict changed everything. For the family, it meant the man who had haunted their lives could no longer hurt anyone else. For the town, it meant the shadow over their community had finally lifted. And for the world, it was proof that no matter how much time passes, the truth can still rise to the surface. The case became a story told again and again, not just of tragedy, but of perseverance, of community, and of justice delayed but not denied. The girl's name would never be forgotten. She was no longer just a missing person. She was a symbol of hope, of love, and of the power of never giving up. And as the town moved forward, people found comfort in knowing that her story had ended not in silence, but in justice. When the trial ended and the man responsible was locked away, many thought the story had finally reached its conclusion. But in truth, the case left behind a legacy far larger than one courtroom verdict. The family also started a foundation in the girl's name. It raised money for missing children's organizations, funded search and rescue programs, and offered scholarships for young people chasing the dreams she never got to fulfill. Every year on her birthday, they held a charity walk with hundreds of people joining in. What once had been a day filled with sorrow became a day of remembrance and action, a way of keeping her spirit alive in a positive way. For the town, the legacy was about unity. The case had torn at their hearts, but it had also brought them together. People who once barely knew each other now saw themselves as part of the same story, bound by the memory of the girl and the fight for justice. The annual candlelight vigil became a tradition, not only to honor her but also to honor all missing children. It was a reminder that even in small towns, tragedies can leave lasting marks, but so can acts of kindness, resilience, and love. Law enforcement also carried lessons from the case. Detectives admitted that in the early years there were mistakes. Leads weren't followed strongly enough. Evidence wasn't tested with the technology available at the time, and the case was nearly forgotten. But the breakthrough years later showed the importance of never closing the book completely. Evidence from cold cases could now be re-examined with new methods like advanced DNA testing, fingerprint analysis, and digital databases. Because of this case, other departments began reopening old files, hoping for their own breakthroughs. One detective described it best. "This case taught us patience. It taught us persistence. It taught us that even when the trail is cold, science and determination can bring it back to life." The case also drew national attention. News outlets highlighted it as an example of how communities should never give up hope, and how families can play a crucial role in keeping missing persons cases alive in the public's memory. The girl's story inspired documentaries, podcasts, and true crime shows, making sure her name would never fade into silence again. But perhaps the most powerful legacy was emotional. It reminded people everywhere that behind every missing persons poster, every headline, and every statistic there is a real child, a real family, and a real community suffering. It reminded the world that justice, no matter how delayed, is worth fighting for. For children in the town, her story became a lesson passed down. Teachers told new generations about her, not as a horror story, but as a reminder of caution, hope, and community strength. The mural painted in her honor on the side of a school wall stood as a symbol, her smile preserved in bright colors, a message that she was never forgotten. Even years after the verdict, people still visited her memorial site. Some left flowers, some left notes, and some just stood in silence, reflecting on the fragility of life and the resilience of the human spirit. For the family, knowing that strangers continued to care brought comfort. Their daughter's life, though cut short, continued to touch the world. The man who took her away would spend the rest of his life in prison, but her memory was free to inspire, free to teach, and free to remind people that love is stronger than cruelty and hope is stronger than despair. Cold cases are often described as frozen in time, but this case proved that time doesn't erase the truth. It only hides it, waiting for the right moment to be uncovered. And when it is, the impact ripples outwards, changing families, communities, and even the justice system itself. In the end, her story was not just one of tragedy, it became one of perseverance, of community standing tall, and of justice that refused to stay buried. Her legacy is not just the pain of her loss, but the strength of what was built in her memory. Today, when people speak of her, they don't only remember the girl who went missing, they remember the girl who brought a town together, the girl whose case changed the way investigators approach cold files, and the girl whose spirit continues to inspire acts of kindness and justice. And maybe that's the truest form of justice, not just punishment for the guilty, but making sure that the innocent are never forgotten, and that their stories continue to light the way for others. Her silence lasted for years, but now her voice echoes louder than ever.